In the interest of time, I will go direct to my questions, and I hope to be able to cover all the four books in this interpellation. I will begin with, although some of this might initially be covered by the previous speakers, but I will just breeze through this. Under Section 2, Declaration of Policies, when we say mandatory, as regards public consultation, can we just project Section 2D? Section 2D, when we say mandatory, the implication of not doing it will have what kind of impact? Will this not be restrictive to national government agencies? Will this not become a basis of red tape?
Mr. Speaker, I think that was already answered yesterday. We invite the good gentleman to read the provision because it says it's only consultation, Mr. Speaker. So while the act of consulting is mandatory, as we mentioned yesterday and the other day, there is no need for an approval or an agreement for these programs and projects to be implemented, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Section 6, it states that a local government unit may be created, divided, and merged. Will it be possible to simply state that a municipality and or a barangay may be created, because that is the only LGUs that the Bangsamoro can create?
Recording stopped.
As we mentioned,
Recording in progress.
2 days ago, we chose to use local government unit in the first part because it talks about the act of creation, division, merger, and abolition of boundaries. And then in the second part, then we have to make a differentiation between the act of parliament, which is through a law, which will allow the parliament to create barangays and municipalities. And on the other hand, the act of sangguniang panlungsod and panglalawigan, which can have the effect of creating, dividing, merging, or abolishing barangays. So it's a matter of style, Mr. Speaker. We do not also want to be redundant in the way we write the provision, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The next is under Section 13. Will it be possible to include airports and seaports? Because we have started to rename airports and seaports. Under Section 13.
The way I understood the discussion in the Parliament pertaining to a proposed resolution, I think, for the renaming of an airport, there has to be another step. No, it's not just within the Bangsamoro government's power. From what I understood, it's even an international body that has to be consulted for the change of the name.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under Section 14, regarding local public holidays, in the last part of the paragraph, can we state that of the respective LGU, to emphasize that the holiday only refers to the respective LGU?
We will read the proposed amendment, Mr. Speaker, so that we can consider it during the period of amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under Section 18, as regards fees and charges, if we could also consider stating that it is subject to such guidelines and limitations as the Congress may provide and consistent with the provisions of Book 2 of this code. We will provide the proposed amendment in the proper time.
May we be clarified as to what section we're referring to, Mr. Speaker?
Section 18.
The
fees.
numbered section 18, the one that's flashed right now, Mr. Speaker?
Okay. Anyway, we will just provide the proposed amendment. I think there's a difference in my list.
Yes.
So we will proceed, Mr. Speaker, to section 32.
Section 32. Original 32 on the left or on
Yes.
the right?
To the right.
Okay, the
Mr. Speaker.
renumbered 32.
If I would like to be informed if this refers to the environmental aspects only, which is a preceding section, the prior consultations.
Section prior.
The section prior to 32 refers to the environment. Section 31, I think, refers to their ecological balance. So does section 32 refer to ecological balance or on a general note?
I think, Mr. Speaker, it may relate to ecological balance because there's reference to section 26. I think that's still the original section 26, but it's also on general matters, which may be consequences of the programs and projects, because the section also refers to section 2C, which was the matter that was raised earlier. And that one does not cover only ecological balance, Mr. Speaker.
Can we flash section 32, Mr. Speaker? So therefore, our interpretation of section 32 is that it refers to all projects, and it says no project or program shall be implemented by authorities unless consultations mentioned in 2C and 26 hereof are complied with and prior approval of the Sanggunian. Are we sure that this refers to all projects, Madam Speaker? Because the gravity of that no project seem to pertain to environmental damage as reflected in 31. I think we should be very clear because the next sentences actually refer to environmental impacts. Because if 32 will apply to all projects, we have to reconsider, Mr. Speaker, because it will impact a lot of national projects that is being implemented in our area.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is the same provision that you find in RA 7160 and also even in MMAA 25, which was the law passed by the ARMM, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, but did that refer to general provisions, Mr. Speaker, or to the entire, or only to section 31?
For RA 7160, it's exactly the same except for the last portion, which pertains to displacement, but exactly the same. No project or program shall be implemented by government authorities unless the consultations mentioned in section 2C and 26 hereof are complied with and prior approval of the Sanggunian concerned is obtained. That's RA 7160, Mr. Speaker. In MMAA 25, which was prevailing or which was passed during the ARMM, no project or program shall be implemented by government authorities unless the consultation mentioned in this code are complied with and prior approval of the Sanggunian concerned is obtained. There's no mention of ecological balance, Mr. Speaker. So it pertains to all projects, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under 40G, as regards disqualifications.
Section 43.
Yes, I think this has extensively been
Uh,
discussed as well.
okay.
However, I would like to
43. I think it's on the
se-
mandatory training, Mr. Speaker. Is that correct?
40G is related.
40G. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
40G. Okay. So it has two scenarios. The first scenario is one cannot run to a relative that is already elected or sitting. And the second scenario is one cannot run together with a relative within the second degree. Mr. Speaker, while the first one has already a precedence as regards the SK bill that provided for this anti-dynasty provision, the new provision of the Bangsamoro is to include those who are still going to file. So in the first part, the COMELEC had required representation stating that they're not related to any elected official in the SK, for example, or in the LGU. In our proposal, how do we require the representation? How do we practically implement this? What kind of statement will the one filing his or her certificate of candidacy represent? Can a person represent and say, I am not related to somebody who is also filing in the same position, because one will only know after the filing of candidacy? And number two, who then decides that one will take precedent over the other?
Mr. Speaker, I think there are three scenarios here, not just two. The first one being that there is an incumbent and a relative also wants to run in the next term. In which case, the one who is incumbent will be given the right to run while the relative will not be allowed to run. In the second scenario, Mr. Speaker, no one is incumbent. Both of them are new candidates. So there is no incumbent. Together with the third scenario, Mr. Speaker, where both of them or all of them are incumbents, the solution is not to allow all of them. So there is no one among the candidates or prospective candidates who will be allowed to run, Mr. Speaker.
Can I try to rephrase it if I understood it correctly? So in the case where two or more people related by affinity or consanguinity files, then all of them will be disqualified to run.
If they are all not incumbent officials?
Yes.
Yes.
So
And if all of them are incumbent, the same solution, Mr. Speaker.
Okay,
No one will be.
Itagalog ko para maintindihan ko po, no? So, magfa-file ako at magfa-file din yung ilagay na meron akong halimbawang half-brother or half-sister na magfa-file.
Mhm.
Or ang lolo ko magfa-file din. Sabay-sabay kaming tatlo nag-file. Hindi namin alam na kami ay magpa-file.
Mhm.
Later on na sinabi ng COMELEC na, uy, nag-file kayong tatlo. Therefore, you are all three of you are disqualified.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. In that case, Mr. Speaker, kung ako ang incumbent at may kalaban ako, ay, tatakbo si Mr. A. Hanap lang ako ng isa sa mga kamag-anak niya, bigyan ko ng 10,000 para mag-file, automatically disqualified na siya. Will that be possible scenario, Madam Chair? Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, I think everything is possible, and especially for candidates who may want to win so much, they can make all the scenarios work for them. But the idea here, Mr. Speaker, is first, we have to have a solution to that scenario, which is not contemplated in the first paragraph. So the second paragraph provides a solution to a scenario where all of them are not incumbent or all of them are incumbent. And the idea is to force the family to talk among themselves and choose who among them would run, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it is in the nature of man to conflict with each other, kahit mag-asawa, magkapatid. And clearly, ever since time began, you cannot by consensus agree, even magkapatid, na lahat tayo ay that is in the ideal world. Anyway, my point, Mr. Speaker, is that this might run contrary to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that we are depriving people to run just because they didn't agree.
Mr. Speaker, as we mentioned yesterday, voting is a right, but the public office, their right, there is no right to run, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege and it can be regulated by law. And anyway, Mr. Speaker, what would be the alternative solution if we want an anti-dynasty provision and we just leave it to the first paragraph? There would be no, and we can always circumvent that prohibition in the two other scenarios, Mr. Speaker. And as we mentioned, the idea is really to force the families. If they are conflicting, then they can agree that one will run for this term and then the other one will run for another term.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the clarification. And I was hoping that there will be some, because in the science of policy, number one, we must consider the unintended consequences. Number two, the practicality. And number three, basis and rationality for policy. So I was hoping that maybe there is a logical policy to select whichever. But anyway,
well,
so,
Mr. Speaker, if there's a proposal, we will gladly accept it and consider it for amendments, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, on this aspect, Mr. Speaker, I think it is enough that we are prohibiting somebody who is already related to the incumbent to run, because that already is in line with the SK law. But to go beyond as to disqualify all who are related and not because of their fault that they're disqualified, then it might be challenging. Anyway, I'll move to the next, Mr. Speaker. As regards not being able to run in a lower position, Section 40I. So the incumbent chief executive cannot run for a lower position. Halimbawa, ikaw ay mayor, hindi ka pwedeng tumakbong vice mayor. Or governor, hindi ka pwedeng tumakbong vice governor. Is that correct, Mr. Speaker?
That is correct, Mr. Speaker. Can we flash the specific?
Section 40I.
Okay.
So, and the reason being is that para hindi ma-circumvent ng law.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. For Section 43, mandatory training. As regards mandatory training, it states that they are already disqualified from, disciplinary action and disqualification. Can we actually disqualify an official who has not yet assumed office, Mr. Speaker?
It's the disqualification from running, Mr. Speaker. This is for the next term, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Section 43, if I read it right, deliberate failure to attend the said training shall constitute sufficient ground for disciplinary action and disqualification. Such disqualification shall continue until he has undergone such training.
Okay,
So-
thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the good gentleman pointing this out. The idea is really to apply the disqualification when he or she runs for the next term, Mr. Speaker.
So, Mr. Speaker, it will become a basis for disqualification on the next term.
That is correct, Mr. Speaker.
So, it means, Mr. Speaker, that there is no remedy for somebody who did not train, and they are forever banned, and at least in the next term, and punished for not being able to train.
Well, it's disqualification for running in the next term.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So then there will be an amendment to this by
Yes,
the
Mr. Speaker.
committee. My next question, Mr. Speaker, is term of office starting on noon of 2022, Section 48. I understand that the barangay elections is set on December 2025. Is it okay that we're mentioning all local elective officials starting from noon, June 30, when the law currently does not synchronize the barangay and the local elections?
Well, I think the idea, Mr. Speaker, is the term is just 3 years, including for local elective officials of the barangay and the Sangguniang Kabataan. So the start of the term for these barangay officials will have to be in October 2023. And the 3-year term will be 3 years after, which is 2026, Mr. Speaker, for the barangay.
So the June 30 only refers to the time where the 3-year term is referenced. It doesn't state that the term starts on June 30. Is this correct, Mr. Speaker? Because I'm confused with the wording. Unless we put except for barangay officials, which is already there in the before it was crushed out.
Mr. Speaker, I believe there's a ruling, a Supreme Court ruling, Makalintal versus Comelec, which says that the succeeding BSKE, the barangay and the Sangguniang Kabataan election shall be held on the first Monday of December 2025 and every 3 years thereafter, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, I agree, Mr. Speaker. That's why I took note of that December 2025, which is not June 30, Mr. Speaker. So I am confused.
That is correct, Mr. Speaker. That is correct. So for the barangay and Sangguniang Kabataan officials, the term would still be 3 years, but the start of the term will not be the same for the other with the other elective officials, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 51, temporary vacancy in the local office of the local chief executive.
Section 51.
It states that when there's a temporary vacancy, an OIC will be appointed, and in no case shall be, or I mean designated, in no case shall be more than 3 days. Can we show the 3 days in the projector, please? 3 days. Now, in terms of practicality, is this 3 days observed? What is stated here is that after designating for 3 days, then the next higher rank political officer can immediately assume without need of any other action from the LCE. My question is, in the practical aspect, is this being observed? Because if it is not, then why don't we extend it to maybe 1 week or 2 weeks? Because in most cases, the mayor, the governor, they do travel for more than 2 weeks or 1 week. But if we pass this, then there might be conflict where the vice mayor or the vice governor will immediately assume, even when there was a designation because the governor or the mayor traveled abroad for 2 weeks.
Mr. Speaker, I think what we've done here is really to reflect what is what
1 minute suspension. Session resumes. We will now continue with the period of interpellation. The interpellator may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I request the Secretariat to please flash Section 43 on the mandatory training? Just to be clarified, Mr. Speaker, Section 43 on the mandatory training and capacity development. So, ibig sabihin, kung ang local barangay or does this, Mr. Speaker, does this refer only to the SK or to all the barangay on the barangay officials regarding the mandatory training?
Mr. Speaker, it covers all elective officials.
Okay, so all elective officials, pag hindi sila nag-training, hindi na sila pwedeng tumakbo ulit. And Mr. Speaker, ang requirement is they will be trained by the Bangsamoro Local Government Academy. Is this correct, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the local government academy or any accredited service provider, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, can we have an idea of how many locally or accredited service provider we are speaking of? Is this by the civil service or by the local government academy?
Mr. Speaker, we don't have any yet because there is no requirement on the course that we are proposing, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I think it is very important to specify because the certification of the Bangsamoro Local Government Academy or the accredited service provider will spell the difference between the right of suffrage and the right to be voted upon by the hindi na po sila pwedeng tumakbo as mentioned kanina.
For the immediately succeeding term, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Kaya nga po, very important, malaman natin ano ba yung aside from LGA? Is this civil service or pwede yung kahit saang training center dyan sa Maynila?
Mr. Speaker, we do have in the succeeding provisions guidance on what kind of what is the course about, and I believe that currently there are some accredited service providers for courses that are offered to newly elected officials, but this is not it. But if we look at that, it can be an academic institution, like I think NCPAG is one accredited service provider. DAP is another, and there may be others who may be interested so long as they comply with the requirements that may be provided in the implementing rules and regulations, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it says here barangay officials, and therefore it pertains to the barangay chairman, the kagawad, SK chairman, SK kagawad, treasurer. Well, at least these officials. Do we have an idea of how many we are speaking about that must be trained before they can actually assume? Compared to the manpower of the Bangsamoro Local Government Academy.
Mr. Speaker, that is the reason why we say there should be accredited service providers, because the local government academy may not be able to cater to the needs of everyone who will be required to undergo this training. This is not just for the barangay, but for, as I said, all elected local officials. They are not required before they sit or assume office. They will be required to undergo this training during their incumbency, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, can we put a clear definition of how many hours we are talking about? Because some can give a training for 1 hour, half a day, or it can be 2 weeks.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that can be provided in the implementing rules and regulations. There are succeeding sections, Mr. Speaker, that would guide the matter, or that would give a guidance on the matter of how many hours and how this can be implemented, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, considering that they will not be allowed to run anymore, are we considering this as a penalty? And if it is a penalty, for what offense? Is this, are we considering not participating in a training as an example of grave misconduct or gross neglect of duty or serious dishonesty? What level of violation did they do? And is it proportional to the penalty that we are providing, Mr. Speaker?
I think if it's a requirement provided under the law, it may fall under neglect of duty, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the interest of time, I will just hope that that can be clarified. But compared to the penalty of not being able to run in the next election, I would be more comfortable to just allow them to assume office after they have undergone the said training for practicality purposes. Mr. Speaker, may I request for Section 31 before we proceed to the others. Under Section 31, regarding the duty of the Bangsamoro government agencies in the maintenance of ecological balance, if we can just correct the term may cause pollution, climate change, because the climate change term is so broad. If it can be characterized by, for example, that may cause pollution, exacerbate climate change. But we will provide the amendment later on. But the point is, it should not be climate change per se.
We'll consider the proposal, Mr. Speaker, at the correct time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under Section 51, so we have clarified that already, that the designation of 3 days, is it okay? Even in practicality, it goes beyond that?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if we go to RA 7160, it's actually the the next in rank who should be taking over during temporary vacancies. But in actuality, it's really someone who is designated by the local chief executive. And therefore, we have accommodated that. But we put a limit, and we think that 3 days would be is
Impractical?
enough. Yes.
Oh, well, okay.
But we should also take into consideration that there is someone who is next in rank who should have that opportunity to assume the responsibilities, albeit in a limited capacity during such temporary incapacity of the chief executive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For Section 54A, can we proceed to Section 54A, where temporary vacancy due to failure of election? Ibig sabihin, hindi natuloy ang eleksyon. At sinasabi dito that an OIC will be designated, and that OIC is a local official. Can we be apprised? Who is the local official? Sino ang local official na i-appoint sa probinsya or sa munisipyo kung hindi natuloy ang local elections?
I think, Mr. Speaker, that is given, that discretion is given to the MILG, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, but with the situation is, hindi natuloy ang provincial election. So walang governor, vice governor, board member. Wala, kung sa munisipyo, walang mayor, vice mayor at councilors. So the MILG will appoint a local official. Can we know ano ang selections ng local official? Sino-sino ba ang local official na tinutukoy natin sapagkat wala rin namang na-elect pa?
The appointive officials, Mr. Speaker.
Appointive officials, can
And under paragraph C, it should also be based on the principle of merit and fitness, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. But can we be apprised to prevent conflict in the future? Ano nga ba ang choices halimbawa ng MILG? But I think magkaiba po yan, dalawa yan. Kung probinsya, ang chief minister. Kung ang munisipyo or city, ang MILG. So can we have a list of who are the local officials that we are talking about? Just to be clear, and hindi maging basis of conflict in the future when this happens.
Well, the idea is there is a failure of election and it's now June 30 and nobody has qualified. So the MILG, in order to prevent a vacuum, may appoint a local official. Can be the administrative officer if it's, pero the co-terminus yun, no?
When we say,
who will be an OIC mayor for the meantime, Mr. Speaker.
so we refer, Mr. Speaker, to a local official within the LGU.
I think that was already answered. Ideally, yes, Mr. Speaker.
So we are talking about appointing a local official who are permanent then employees of the LGU. At ito yung pwedeng mga provincial planning, provincial accountant, auditor, yun po ba ang tinutukoy natin? At hindi line agency ng region? Kasi pwede po nating ilagay na local official of the LGU concerned para medyo mas klaro. Kasi kung LGU official, kahit sino po yun.
So, Mr. Speaker, I did not get the last part.
Ang tanong ko
The
po,
option is?
when we say local official, halimbawa po, no, hindi natuloy ang municipal elections. So, saan manggagaling ang local official? Manggagaling ba siya sa loob ng munisipyo?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, okay. So, baka pwede sa amendment lagyan ng LGU official of the respective LGU. Para po, klaro, na hindi siya manggagaling sa baka yung Secretary General ng BTA i-appoint as mayor o IC mayor.
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, it says local official.
Or halimbawa, ibang local official po. Halimbawa, so we're not referring to the line agency official? Halimbawa yung sino ba? Municipal agriculturist? Or
But
ano
the
ba?
idea, Mr. Speaker, is upon devolution, these officers will be local officials, appointive officials.
Okay. So this does not refer also to the MLGOO. Does this exclude the municipal local government officer of the MILG?
From what I understand, Mr. Speaker, the MLGOO will not be a local official because even with devolution, the local government operations officer would still be under the Ministry of the Interior and Local Government.
Mr. Speaker, can the municipal planning officer of one municipality be designated as OIC of another municipality?
Yes, we agreed earlier that it will be from the same LGU.
Okay, so we just hope that that can be amended to state the respective LGU, and at least on the records of this parliament, it also states that. And the merit and fitness is defined as, Mr. Speaker, can we explain when we say designated on the basis of, on the principle of merit and fitness?
I think we have standards, Mr. Speaker, under civil service law, rules and regulations.
So meaning the one with the higher merit and fitness will have higher chance of being appointed, Mr. Speaker? Or is it a political decision by the Chief Minister or MILG?
I think, Mr. Speaker, the MILG will have to choose someone who he or she thinks would be able to carry out the functions of an OIC for the time being, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, and for the province, will the MILG be the recommending official?
I think it covers all vacancies, Mr. Speaker. For
It is
province, city, or municipality.
yeah, and it is for the purpose of explaining the prohibition that they will not be related within, is that correct? Fourth civil degree of the recommending and appointing authority.
Mr. Speaker, may I be enlightened as to what section the good gentleman is referring to
Okay.
in relation to the appointment? Because this is just a designation, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Okay. So I would just move to section 61, Mr. Speaker, on the quorum. 61. On the quorum, it states that having been elected and qualified will be the basis of quorum. Are the sectoral representatives who are appointed and not elected included in the definition of quorum?
Mr. Speaker, they will be elected.
Only
So
the elected?
The sectoral representatives will be included in the computation of the quorum because they will be elected, Mr. Speaker, under the amendments, Mr. Speaker.
So all sectoral representatives are elected?
Except for the indigenous peoples, I think there would be accommodation as to how they choose from among themselves their representative in the Sangguniang.
So on the case of the IP, will they not be included in the definition of quorum? Being appointed sectoral representatives?
Well, right now, Mr. Speaker, it would seem that the amendment says they're all elected, but there was a manifestation earlier, yesterday, from MP Mendoza that they should be allowed to undergo a process that is within their traditional practices, Mr. Speaker.
In which case, my concern, Mr. Speaker, is only to just add that there are appointive members who can then be included in the reference of quorum.
I think yes, Mr. Speaker. They
Thank
will
you,
still
Mr. Speaker.
be counted. Mr.
Now, for 61D, Mr. Speaker, if we would read it, it says Sangguniang members who fail to attend for 4 consecutive regular and special sessions will not be included in the counting of quorum. But there's no more mention about being suspended. So are we saying that that provision no longer has teeth and there's no such suspension after 4 absences?
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. So this contemplates of, this answers the question of whether, of what is the basis for counting the quorum. So we're just excluding those who fail to attend the 4 consecutive sessions, whether regular or special, and those who are on preventive suspension, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, but the original Section D is actually a penalty clause, which defines those who didn't attend for 4 regular sessions are preventively suspended, which is now absent in the amended Section D. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is that technically we have already deleted the penal clause of the 4 absences.
I think it's in another provision, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank
This
you.
is just the quorum.
For that clarification, Mr. Speaker. Now, 63D, on the issue about filing of cases on officials, 63D. And the term there is that when they believe that a fair and just resolution is not obtained, how do we measure or rationalize this, Mr. Speaker? What is our basis to say that they believe that there's no fair and just resolution, that they could immediately proceed to filing it with the Chief Minister?
I think, Mr. Speaker, then the complainant will have to show and justify the filing with the Office of the Chief Minister and show that there is either a conflict of interest or that the case will be rendered moot if they're not able to get the decision from the highest level, or that it is going to be they will not be able to get a just resolution of the case.
In this case, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister will act in a quasi-judicial capacity. So who will be doing the decision and penning the decisions, Mr. Speaker? Who will be doing the hearing on this?
There is going to be a hearing officer. I think that person is mentioned in another provision, but the Chief Minister is also, the Office of the Chief Minister will also is also mandated to issue rules and regulations pertaining to this power, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 109, composition of local development councils. The mandatory member from the IP. So my question is, when we say IP, is it only non-Moro IP or to the marginalized Moro IP?
We have taken out non-Moro, Mr. Speaker, meaning it would cover those who are native inhabitants, and that may cover those who ascribe to the Bangsamoro identity and those who do not, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So Section 115 on the Secretariat. If it is possible to also include the treasurer and accountant in the Development Council, to include the accountant.
In the Secretariat, Mr. Speaker? This is Secretariat of the Local Development Council, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. I think my recommendation is more on the entire council. On Section 128, Mr. Speaker. 128. So we have defined, we have provided that there will just be ad hoc committees within the peace and order councils of the province and city and municipality to address RIDO and to settle disputes. So, Mr. Speaker, when we say RIDO, it's already when the issues have already been elevated. But does it mean, Mr. Speaker, that we will no longer provide for mediation mechanisms within the municipality, city, and provincial level?
Mr. Speaker, there's still the katarungang pambarangay. For as long as the conflict is within the jurisdiction of the katarungang pambarangay, that can still be a platform for resolving disputes. This one contemplates of an escalated, as mentioned, conflict that has escalated to include other members of the clan, and that may now no longer be viable. It may no longer be viable to, or even legal to have the conflict lodged in the Katarungan Pambarangay. So this is an option, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 323.
Yes. What section, Mr. Speaker?
Section 323, Local
323.
Finance Committee.
Okay. That's book.
It's already in another book, Mr. Speaker.
I think still book 2, no?
2, yeah. 323.
Financing?
Yes, Local
Okay.
Finance Committee. Okay, I think it's in the original section 323 about Local Finance Committee. Can we type Local Finance Committee? Local Finance Committee. There. The Local Finance Committee composed of the budget treasurer, budget officer. If the accountant can also be a member of the Local Finance Committee.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is copied from what is provided under the National Local Government Code, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under section 435, Mr. Speaker.
Or the original 435 or the renumbered.
I think, can we look at the 435 that is renumbered? Yes. And so the 200 is no longer there. If the 200 is no longer there, then it's okay, Mr. Speaker. If we could go back to section 169. Under section 169 regarding fisheries. So this includes per signers, Mr. Speaker. Does this contemplate the inclusion of the per signers? As we know, in the Basuta, we have so much aquatic resources, pero hindi naman taga doon ang nag-collect. So I just want to be assured na our municipal LGUs are provided the power to provide fees.
Mr. Speaker, I think the per signers are usually would not be found within municipal waters, Mr. Speaker. So that may go beyond the jurisdiction of municipal governments, Mr. Speaker. So,
Mr. Speaker, where will we find, where will the Bangsamoro government or the Bangsamoro people be able to tax yung mga nangingisda sa Bangsamoro waters na billion-billion?
Mr. Speaker, if these boats and per signers if they operate beyond the municipal waters, they may be still covered, and if they are still covered or it's still within the Bangsamoro waters, then this would be covered by the revenue code, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, yung under number 3, Sangguniang Bayan of the same article, it states that 3 tons or less. But I think the per-signers are not part of that. And it also states that exclusively within the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. Does that have implication when we say exclusively? Because there's a very thin line between the national waters and between the Bangsamoro waters. So ibig sabihin, pag hindi exclusive sa Bangsamoro waters ay hindi na covered ng provision na ito?
This pertains to the issuance of license by the LGU. So some may, if it does not fall here, it may be covered by the revenue code, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 303, under credit financing, it states stabilizing local finances as a basis for getting credit finance by the LGU. So what do we exactly mean by stabilizing local finances? Under section 303, the general policy, public investment.
3?
Yes, section 303, general policy.
Okay, I think it contemplates of a situation where there is deficit in the funds of the LGU, and there may be a need to enter into agreements with lending institutions and
So
private banks.
if it is just for a PPP, Mr. Speaker, then they cannot loan? Because then the stabilizing local finances will be a condition sine qua non to getting a loan. What if they are in good financial stability and they want to enter into PPPs for economic development? Anyway, at least it will be noted.
Yes, I think it's not just for, because I was asked earlier regarding the stabilizing effect or the purpose, but there may be other purposes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 331, budgetary requirements.
331.
Under letter E, it provides no less than 20% of the annual tax allotment shall be for development projects. If I remember right, Mr. Speaker, there was a proposition by Minister Bides that was approved by the committee on providing for 5% of that 20% for the maintenance of local roads. It was already approved in the committee, so I don't understand why it is no longer there.
In another law, Mr. Speaker?
It was in the deliberation of the, it was,
Of the committee?
yes.
Mhm. We will check, Mr. Speaker, because this is the documentation of the discussion.
In fact, I remember that the proponent, Mr. Speaker, was the one who did the mathematical formula of converting the 1% NTA to 5% of the 20%.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, we will look into the documentation of the discussion in the committee level, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to note also that that's why I pushed for 1% road maintenance, because we did also push for 1% for senior citizens, 1% for PWDs, and 1% for the local council and protection of children. Did we have any rational reference to push for this 3% in the total NTA, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, I think those allotment would also fall under the 20%, Mr. Speaker. And we can make a more detailed listing under letter E, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I remember right, I was also hoping that 1% would be allocated, or 1% of the NTA be allocated for the barangay justice, Mr. Speaker. But then I will proceed to Book 3, Mr. Speaker, for in consideration of time, and proceed to the few more sections. Under Section 400, Mr. Speaker.
400.
May I ask the good gentleman, how many minutes do you?
I think this will just be a little more than 5 minutes to less than 10 minutes, Mr. Speaker, depending on the answer of the proponent.
We will give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 400, revalidation of barangays.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
What is the mechanism of this? Considering that the land survey showed that out of the 1.5 million hectares, there's a very big discrepancy in the survey. How will the MILG undergo with this, especially in terms of land area and boundary disputes?
Yes. Mr. Speaker, this pertains to barangays, and under our law, under BLGC and 7160 and MA 25, the requirement for barangays would only pertain to population, Mr. Speaker. There's no land area requirement, Mr. Speaker. But in answer to the question, it will be the MILG that shall undertake the revalidation, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Section 415, we provided for the authority to carry firearms for barangay officials. Is this not already provided under the law that they must have the LTOP and the permit to carry?
I think, Mr. Speaker, that would
415,
that would
Mr.
still
Speaker?
apply, Mr. Speaker.
415? Mr. Speaker, under 416, composition of the barangay. 416.
Yes.
Composition. We refer to mandatory representatives from the IP. Does this only refer to the non-Moro IP or to include marginalized IP?
If it does not distinguish, Mr. Speaker, it covers both.
So, for example, Mr. Speaker, in Sulu or Basilan, where there are the Sama Bajau, they will be represented in this barangay?
Provided that they comply with the requirements, Mr. Speaker, that there's the number of their representatives in the Sanggunian would not be more than 50%.
And this will be also applicable in the municipalities?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And the provinces and cities, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, 419 on the barangay secretary, it lists so many responsibilities. Mr. Speaker, are barangay secretaries regular government employees with regular salaries?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
And are they regular employees that is covered by the civil service? If we look at it, they have 1, 2, 3, 8 very heavy responsibilities.
Well, Mr. Speaker, their service would be considered government or service.
Their service will be considered government service. Mr. Speaker, will they have mandatory contribution to the GSIS?
No, Mr. Speaker, right?
No. Although we provided that they will have insurance. So what kind of insurance are we anticipating here?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think if we can look at that specific provision. Ano ba? Saan?
Anyway, these comments, Mr. Speaker, in general, for lack of time, refers to all the barangay official, the secretary, and the treasurer. They are not regular employees because they don't have GSIS. And our proposal here gives a cap of, in section 405. Can we proceed to section 405, Madam Speaker? Mr. Speaker, it states that from 5,000 to maximum of grade 14, which is 33K for a barangay official. I wonder, for a barangay official in Cotabato City, will 44,000 suffice? Can it not be higher for barangay officials to be paid a salary? Why did we cap it to SG 14? Can it not be 20?
Well, in fact, Mr. Speaker, this is already a step forward considering it's not even provided in the national law, Mr. Speaker.
So we are providing them a salary grade equal to SG 14. However, we are not still regularizing them because they will still not be allowed to contribute to the GSIS.
Because, Mr. Speaker, the funds for the payment of honorarium or salaries would be taken from the funds of the barangay.
Considering
So
that,
it can be higher, provided that there will be enough funds in the coffers of the barangay.
Mr. Speaker, but we provided a ceiling of not more than
I mean, from 5,000 pesos, Mr. Speaker, from the minimum.
Mr. Speaker, the work of a barangay chairman, especially here in Cotabato City, is very heavy. Baka naman pwedeng i-consider in the amendment to increase that, no? And number two, kung pwedeng mag-contribute na sila ng GSIS. Because I interviewed a lot of the barangay chairman here in Cotabato, and yun yung sentimento nila after 9 years na pagiging barangay chairman, wala man silang GSIS. Eh napakabigat na kanilang trabaho. But for lack of time, again, I will proceed in 476. Local income in the creation of a municipality. 476. When we say local income, Mr. Speaker, are we referring to the era of the barangay, or are these locally generated?
That would include both, Mr. Speaker. I think the succeeding section also clarifies the requirement in terms of income in another section, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now proceeding to the next, under Article 504, as regards the Cooperative Development Officer, we have amended the provision in the Bangsamoro to include cooperatives and social enterprise authority. So will this not be cooperative and social enterprise officer?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, that can be included in the nomenclature.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under 545, qualifications and duties of tourism officers, it is only optional. But maybe because of the fact that we are pushing for more economic development, we can consider this in the amendment. Now, going to my last three questions. Under the devolution, Mr. Speaker, the national government had provided Executive Order 138, which is the full devolution requiring all LGUs to have a devolution transition plan. Is this devolution aspect under Article or Section 584 aware of that EO 138?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the same executive order says that the Bangsamoro is exempted from that, from the provisions of that executive order, and that we may have our own devolution plan. Considering the fact that we are looking at a local governance code, then we provided the guidance and specific powers that will be devolved to LGUs, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the national provides for a growth with equity fund. So in that case, the Bangsamoro will not be part of that growth with equity fund provision of EO 138.
Well, the same EO which was issued by the national government says that the farming is exempt, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the last point, Mr. Speaker, under section 587, under 587, it provides the implementation of section 43. It provides for the implementation of section 43 and 45G, not applicable for a period of 5 years upon effectivity of this code. So, can we flash that provision? So 43 and 45G. Now 43 talks about the mandatory training. So we will not implement that until after 5 years. Is that correct?
Yes, that
Mr.
is
Speaker?
correct, Mr. Speaker. To give more time to the local government academy and the MILG.
Now, the
Prepare.
next one talks about 45G. Can we go to 45G?
I think that is
Are
already
you winding up now?
Yes, this is the last question, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the patience of the Parliament.
Mr. Speaker, we are referring to the anti-dynasty there, so there may have been a mistake in the...
So you're actually referring to 40G,
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
And
so-
training.
Yes, so you're referring to 43 and 40G instead of 45G.
Correct,
So
Mr.
that is all my question, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the hard work of the Committee on Local Government and the patience of the Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.